His breath hit the bare skin of her collarbone like a whispered command, and every nerve in Sophie's body ignited as though struck by lightning wrapped in silk. The heat of his chest pressed against her spine, those inked arms caging her against the cold marble wall, and she felt the low rumble of his voice vibrate through her ribs before the words even formed. "You belong to this house now," he murmured, his lips hovering a single devastating millimeter from the pulse hammering in her throat. Her knees went liquid. Her fingers curled into the fabric of his shirt, gripping the cotton as though the earth itself were tilting beneath her feet. The scent of cedar and black tea and something darker, something that lived only in the shadow beneath his jaw, flooded her senses until thought became impossible and only feeling remained. That was the moment Sophie understood she had walked into a cage gilded with moonlight and locked from the inside. 3 weeks earlier, the red envelope had arrived at her grandmother's kitchen table in Kumasi, Ghana, sealed with wax the color of dried blood. The letter inside bore the crest of Hanjin Sovereign Holdings, a conglomerate so vast its shadow stretched from Busan shipyards to Lagos telecom towers. The words were surgical, merciless. The Ajay Ancestral Grove, 17 acres of sacred baobab forest, where Sophie's lineage had buried their dead for 9 generations, had been collateralized by her late uncle against a development loan he could never repay. The foreclosure was absolute. The bulldozers would arrive in 30 days unless the debt, for $0.7 million, was settled in full. Sophie had stared at the paper until the letters blurred, her grandmother's weathered hand trembling over the carved wooden stool where elders had sat for 200 years. The grove was not land. It was memory made soil. It was the place where her mother's voice still lived in the rustle of ancient leaves. Losing it meant severing the root that connected every Ajay soul, living and departed, to the earth that made them who they were. She had tried everything. Crowdfunding campaigns that raised $11,000 before stalling. Petitions to the Regional Heritage Council that vanished into bureaucratic silence. A desperate call to a cousin in London who stopped answering after the second ring. The deadline shrank like a noose tightening with each sunrise. Then, on the 23rd night, a black sedan appeared on the dirt road outside their compound, and a man in a charcoal suit stepped out holding a second envelope. This one was handwritten. The script was elegant, angular, written in ink that smelled faintly of sandalwood. It read, "Come to Seoul. Repay what is owed through service. The grove will be returned, deed clean, name restored. You have my word." Signed beneath in a single Korean character was the name Jun Seo-han. Sophie had researched him for 6 hours straight, cross-referencing financial databases and society pages until her eyes burned. Jun Seo-han, 28 years old, sole heir to the Hanjin Sovereign Empire. The photographs showed a man carved from something harder than marble, shoulders broad enough to eclipse a doorway, forearms roped with muscle beneath rolled sleeves that revealed elaborate tattoos crawling from wrist to elbow, serpentine dragons and geometric patterns in black and crimson ink that disappeared beneath his collar. His face was devastating in its symmetry, high cheekbones, a jaw that could cut glass, dark eyes that held the flat, patient cruelty of a predator who never needed to chase because the prey always came to him. Society columns called him the Ice Heir. Business journals documented his acquisition of 14 heritage sites across 3 continents, each one flattened and rebuilt as luxury condominiums. He did not collect history, he consumed it, and yet his letter promised the grove's return. Sophie packed a single bag. Her grandmother pressed a small clay pendant into her palm, shaped like a baobab seed, warm from decades of being worn against skin. "You carry us with you?" the old woman whispered, her eyes wet but unbroken. "Whatever he asks, remember whose daughter you are." Sophie kissed her forehead, stepped into the sedan, and watched the red earth of Kumasi dissolve in the rearview mirror until it was nothing but a memory of color. Seoul hit her like a wall of glass and neon. The Hanjin estate sat in the hills above the city, a sprawling compound of traditional Hanok architecture fused with brutalist concrete, surrounded by walls so high the sky became a narrow ribbon overhead. A housekeeper named Mrs. Park, small and precise with silver hair pinned in a perfect bun, met Sophie at the gate and led her through corridors of polished wood and hanging scroll paintings. "Your room is prepared," Mrs. Park said, her tone carrying the careful neutrality of someone who had seen many arrangements and judged none. Master Han will see you at midnight. He is particular about punctuality. The word midnight landed in Sophie's stomach like a stone dropped into still water. Her room was beautiful in the way a museum exhibit is beautiful, curated, cold, designed to be observed rather than inhabited. Silk sheets in charcoal gray. A single orchid on the nightstand. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking a garden of raked gravel and black pines. Sophie stood at the glass and pressed her forehead against the cool surface, watching the city lights flicker below like scattered embers. She was 22 years old. She had a degree in environmental science she had never used. She had kissed exactly 2 boys in her life, both clumsy and sweet and nothing like the man whose name now owned her next 30 days. Her reflection stared back at her, deep brown skin luminous in the moonlight, full lips pressed tight, dark eyes wide with a fear she refused to name. She touched the clay pendant at her throat and breathed. The hours until midnight stretched like taffy pulled too thin. Sophie changed into the clothes laid out on the bed. A simple black dress that fell to her knees, elegant and austere. She braided her hair back from her face. She practiced standing still, practicing the composure her grandmother had drilled into her since childhood. You are a J. You do not flinch. At 11:58, a knock came at her door. Mrs. Park appeared, expressionless. He is waiting in the east study. Follow the corridor to the end. Do not speak until spoken to. Sophie nodded, her throat too tight for words, and stepped into the hallway where the wooden floors swallowed the sound of her bare feet. The east study was vast, lined with books in Korean and English, a massive desk of black walnut dominating the center. And behind it, standing with his back to the window where moonlight poured in like spilled mercury, was Jun Seo-han. He was taller than the photographs suggested, broader, the tattoos on his forearms vivid even in the silver light, a coiling dragon on his left arm with scales rendered in such fine detail they seemed to shift when he moved, geometric sacred patterns on his right that climbed beneath his rolled sleeves and vanished at his biceps. His white shirt was unbuttoned at the collar, revealing the edge of ink at his throat. His dark eyes found Sophie the instant she crossed the threshold, and the temperature in the room dropped 10 degrees. You are 2 minutes early, he said. His voice was low, textured, carrying the faintest accent that softened consonants into something almost musical. I did not expect punctuality from someone whose family could not manage a simple loan repayment. The cruelty was casual, offhand. A blade slid between ribs with a smile. Sophie felt it land but kept her spine straight, her chin level. I am here to honor the agreement, she said, and was proud that her voice did not shake. Tell me what you require. He studied her for a long moment, those dark eyes cataloging every inch of her with the detached precision of an appraiser examining a painting. Then he moved around the desk, each step deliberate, and stopped close enough that she could smell the cedar and black tea, close enough that the heat radiating from his chest made the fine hairs on her arms rise. Every night at midnight, he said, his gaze dropping to the pendant at her throat and lingering there with an expression she could not decipher. You will sit in this room. You will pour my tea. You will listen while I speak. You will not leave until I dismiss you. You will not question. You will not refuse. This is the service. Sophie blinked. She had braced for something monstrous, something that would crack her open and leave her in pieces on his polished floor. Instead, he was asking her to pour tea and be silent. The relief was so sudden it made her dizzy, and she saw something flicker in his eyes at her visible softening, something sharp and almost offended, as though her relief had insulted him. Did you imagine something else? He asked quietly, tilting his head, the dragon on his forearm flexing as he crossed his arms. Something more degrading? The word hung between them, charged and dangerous. Sophie met his gaze and did not look away. I imagined what a man does when he buys another person's silence, she said. I imagined what men like you always want. His jaw tightened, a muscle feathered beneath the skin. For one fractured second, something raw and wounded surfaced in those cold eyes before the ice sealed over again. Pour the tea, he said, turning back to his desk. The pot is on the side table. 3 leaves per cup. Water at 80 degrees, never boiling. You will learn. And so began the midnight ritual. Each night Sophie walked the corridor in bare feet, entered the study where moonlight painted everything in shades of silver and shadow, and performed the small, precise ceremony of heating water, measuring leaves, pouring the pale gold liquid into ceramic cups thin as eggshell. Jun Seo-han sat at his desk reviewing documents, speaking occasionally in clipped sentences about the day's acquisitions, the board meetings, the rivals he was dismantling with the patience of a man playing a very long game. He spoke to her as one speaks to a wall, or perhaps to a diary, unloading the architecture of his empire in fragments while she listened, poured, refilled, and said nothing. The silence between his words grew heavier each night, denser, until Sophie felt it pressing against her eardrums like deep water. On the 4th night, he spoke about his mother. Not the polished society figure in the magazines, but a woman who had scrubbed floors in a Busan fish market before his father's first venture succeeded, who had died of exhaustion when Jun Seo was 9, whose hands had been cracked and bleeding the last time he held them. He said it flatly, without emotion, staring at a point above Sophie's left shoulder. She poured his tea and said nothing, but her hand trembled slightly, and a single drop of gold liquid splashed onto the saucer. He noticed. His eyes dropped to the small stain, then rose to her face, and something in his expression shifted. A crack in the permafrost, narrow and quickly sealed. "You are sentimental," he observed. "It will be your weakness here." But he did not dismiss her early that night, and when she finally rose to leave, he said, almost too quietly to hear, the tea was adequate. On the 7th night, Sophie broke the rule. He was speaking about the 14th Heritage Site, a temple complex in Myanmar he had purchased and intended to level for a resort. Something in the casual destruction of it, the erasure of centuries of prayer ground into gravel for a swimming pool, ignited a coal in Sophie's chest that she could not swallow. "They prayed there for 600 years, she said, and her voice came out rough, unsteady. "You cannot simply decide that their prayers are worth less than your profit margin." The silence that followed was absolute. Jun Seo-han set down his pen with exaggerated care, aligned it parallel to the desk's edge, and looked at her. The temperature plummeted. "You spoke without permission," he said, each word a nail driven slowly into wood. "You questioned my judgment. You forgot what you are in this house." Sophie's heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. She should apologize. She should lower her eyes and pour the tea and be the silent vessel he required. Instead, she lifted her chin, let him see the fire in her dark eyes, the unbreakable Ajay stubbornness her grandmother had forged into her bones. "I forgot nothing," she said. "I remember exactly what I am. I am the woman whose family's sacred ground you hold in your fist. I am not your servant. I am your creditor's daughter, and I will not pretend that what you do to the world's memory is anything but violence dressed in a suit." He stood. The motion was fluid, sudden, and he was across the room in 2 strides, towering over her. The tattoos on his arms vivid and alive in the lamplight, the dragon seeming to writhe as his muscles tensed. His hand came up and Sophie flinched, a small involuntary jerk she could not suppress, and he froze. His fingers hovered an inch from her jaw, not touching, suspended in the charged air between them. His breathing changed, deepened, became audible. She could see the pulse at his throat, rapid and betraying. "You flinch," he whispered, and the words carried a weight far beyond their surface, as though her small recoil had struck something ancient and tender in him. "You think I would strike you?" It was not a question. Sophie swallowed. "I think you are a man who destroys things for a living," she said softly. "I think destruction is the only language you speak fluently." His hand dropped to his side. He stepped back, the distance between them refilled with cold air. "Leave," he said, and his voice was hoarse, stripped of its usual controlled precision. "Tonight is finished. Leave." Sophie walked the corridor on shaking legs, the clay pendant warm against her sternum, and did not sleep until dawn painted the gravel garden in shades of rose. She expected dismissal the next night, a termination of the arrangement, the grove lost forever. Instead, at 11:58, the knock came as always. Mrs. Park's face was unreadable. "He is waiting." Sophie walked the corridor again. He was standing at the window when she entered, his back to her, the moonlight catching the ink on his neck where the tattoos climbed above his collar. A pattern she had not seen before, something that looked like roots, like the branching veins of a baobab tree rendered in fine black lines. He turned as she crossed the threshold, and his expression was different. The ice thinned to something translucent, almost fragile. "Sit," he said, and gestured to the chair beside his desk rather than the usual position by the tea table. Sophie sat. He poured the tea himself, his large tattooed hands surprisingly gentle with the delicate ceramic, and set the cup before her. "The Myanmar temple," he said, settling into his own chair and watching her over the rim of his cup. "I have postponed the demolition. Indefinitely." Sophie stared at him. "Why?" He shrugged, a roll of those broad shoulders that made the fabric of his shirt strain. "You were right. It was violence dressed in a suit. I have been wearing that suit for a long time." He paused, his dark eyes holding hers with an intensity that made her breath catch, that made the air between them thicken until breathing became a conscious effort. "No one has spoken to me like that since I was 9 years old. No one has looked at me and seen the destruction rather than the empire. You saw it. You said it aloud. And I could not stop thinking about the sound of your voice saying it. The nights after that were different. The tea ceremony remained. The midnight hour remained. But the silence between them transformed from a wall into a bridge." He spoke more, not just of acquisitions and boardrooms but of the boy in Busan who had watched his mother's hands bleed, who had sworn he would never be powerless again, who had built an empire of control because the alternative was to feel the helplessness of a 9-year-old holding cold fingers. Sophie listened, and slowly, carefully, she spoke back. She told him about the baobab grove, how her grandmother said the trees remembered every name ever whispered beneath their branches. She told him about her mother, who had died when Sophie was 14, who had sung lullabies in Chui that Sophie could still hear in dreams. She told him about the clay pendant, how it had been fired in the grove's soil, how it carried the mineral memory of 9 generations. He listened with his whole body, leaning forward, those tattooed arms resting on his knees, his dark eyes never leaving her face as though memorizing every syllable. On the 12th night, their fingers touched over the teapot. It was accidental, a brush of his knuckles against hers as she reached for the handle, but the contact sent a shock through Sophie's entire nervous system. A jolt of heat that traveled up her arm and detonated behind her sternum. She gasped, a small broken sound, and he went very still. His hand remained where it was, his knuckles pressed to the side of her fingers, the skin of his tattooed hand rough and warm against hers. Neither moved. The moonlight held them in its silver grip. "Sophie," he said, and it was the first time he had spoken her name, and the way it sounded in his mouth, low and careful, as though the syllables were something precious he was afraid to crush, made her eyes sting with sudden tears. "I am not a good man," he continued, his thumb moving a fraction of an inch, tracing the edge of her knuckle with a touch so light it was almost imaginary. "I have taken things that were not mine. I have erased things that should have endured. I do not know how to be gentle with what I want." His gaze dropped to her lips, then back to her eyes, and the hunger in that look was not the cold appraisal of the first night but something raw and terrified. A man standing at the edge of a cliff he had built himself, looking down. "But I want to learn," he whispered. "With you, if you would allow it." Sophie's hand turned beneath his, and her fingers laced through his, and the sound he made, a low exhale that was almost a groan, vibrated through their joined hands and into her bones. She stood, and he stood with her, and they were close, so close she could count the individual lines of ink on his forearm, could see the fine scar at his temple, could feel the heat of his breath on her forehead. His free hand rose, slow, giving her every chance to pull away, and his fingertips touched her jaw, tilting her face up, his thumb brushing the corner of her mouth with a reverence that made her knees weaken. "You are not my debt," he said, his voice rough, fractured. "You were never the debt. The grove was always going to be returned." I wrote that letter because I needed a reason to bring you here. Because I saw your photograph in the Heritage Council filing and I could not stop looking at your eyes. I am a selfish man, Sophie. I stole you from your home because I was lonely, and I dressed it in obligation because I am a coward. The confession fell between them like a shattered glass, sharp and glittering and impossible to ignore. If the story has set your heart racing, if you felt that midnight tension in your own chest, then do something for me right now. Hit that like button until it turns red. Subscribe to AMBW Romance Stories so you never miss a single night of these tales. Drop a comment telling me what you would have whispered back to him in that moment, and share this with someone who needs to feel their pulse quicken tonight. You are not alone in wanting this kind of story, this kind of fire. We are building something here, a community of hearts that beat faster at midnight, and I need you in it. Sophie looked at him. This man with his empire of glass and his mother's bleeding hands and his tattoos that told stories in ink what his mouth could not say in words. She saw the boy in Busan. She saw the loneliness armored in cruelty. She saw the roots tattooed on his neck, the baobab pattern he had gotten. She realized with a sudden lurch, after she had told him about the grove. He had carried her story on his skin for days before he could speak it aloud. She reached up and pressed her palm flat against his chest, over his heart, and felt it hammering beneath the cotton, wild and unguarded. "Then we are both thieves," she said softly. "I stole your silence. You stole my freedom. And now we owe each other something that cannot be paid in tea or midnight hours." His hand covered hers on his chest, pressing her palm harder against the beat, and his forehead dropped to hers, his breath mingling with hers, warm and shaking. "Stay," he said, a single word stripped of command, of ownership, of every cold structure he had built between them. Just a man asking, just a heart laid bare beneath tattooed skin. Not as a debtor, not as a servant. Stay because you choose to. Stay and let me learn what it means to build instead of take. The grove was returned the following morning. A courier arrived with a deed, clean and unencumbered. The Ajay name restored in permanent legal ink. Sophie called her grandmother from the estate's garden, standing among the black pines with the Seoul skyline glittering below, and wept while the old woman laughed and blessed her in Chui, calling her brave girl, her stubborn girl, her daughter of the baobab. The clay pendant was warm against Sophie's throat, warm as a living thing, as though the soil of Kumasi were sending its heat across 6,000 miles to say, "You are still rooted, you are still ours." The weeks that followed were not a fairy tale. They were two people learning the grammar of tenderness after lifetimes of speaking only in power and survival. Jun Seo-han resigned from 3 board positions. He established a heritage preservation fund, the first allocation directed to the Ajay Grove and 11 other sites he had previously marked for development. Sophie enrolled in a conservation program at a Seoul university, studying the science of protecting what the earth remembers. They argued. They stumbled. He retreated into silence when the old patterns surfaced, and she retreated into distance when his intensity became a tide she could not swim against. But each midnight, they met in the East study, not as master and servant but as two people sharing tea and truth, and slowly the ritual transformed from obligation into the most sacred hour of either of their days. On the 30th night, the last night of the original agreement, Sophie poured the tea and set the cup before him and said, "The debt is paid." He looked at the cup, then at her, and something in his face crumbled and reformed, a tectonic shift behind his eyes. "There is no debt," he said. "There was never a debt. There is only this. You, me, the midnight and the tea and the sound of your breathing in my house." He reached across the desk and took her hand, drawing her around the walnut surface until she stood between his knees, his tattooed arms encircling her waist, his face pressed against her stomach, his breath hot through the fabric of her dress. "I am terrified," he murmured against her, and the admission cost him something visible, a tightening around his eyes, a vulnerability that would have been unthinkable 30 days ago. "I have never been terrified of anything. Boardrooms, acquisitions, rivals, none of it. But the thought of you walking out that gate tomorrow and not coming back makes my hands shake." Sophie threaded her fingers through his dark hair, feeling the tension in his scalp, the rigid control he maintained even in surrender. She tilted his face up and looked into those dark eyes, now stripped of every wall, every defense, every layer of ice he had spent 19 years building. "I am not walking out that gate," she said. "I am staying. Not because of a deed or a debt or a heritage site. I am staying because you poured me tea with shaking hands and told me you were lonely. I am staying because you put my grandmother's trees on your skin. I am staying because at midnight in this room you are not the ice air. You are just a man who needs someone to sit beside him and say, 'I see you. And I see you, Jun Seohan. I see all of you.'" He kissed her forehead, slow and lingering. His lips pressed to her skin for a long breath that stretched into 2, into 3, his arms tightening around her waist as though she were the only solid thing in a dissolving world. Then her cheeks, her temples, the corner of her eye where a tear had escaped. Each kiss a question, each kiss a prayer. And when his mouth finally found hers, it was gentle, achingly gentle. A man handling something he believed he did not deserve. His thumb tracing her jaw, his breath mingling with hers in the moonlit silence of the East study. Sophie kissed him back with everything she had, with the stubbornness of the Ajay line, with the fire of the baobab grove, with the fierce tenderness of a woman who had walked into a cage and found, at its center, another caged thing waiting to be set free. The midnight hour stretched and deepened around them, the city lights flickering below the window like a field of earthbound stars, the tea cooling in its cups, the moon climbing higher and painting the tattoos on his arms in liquid silver. They stayed like that for a long time, foreheads joined, breathing together, 2 hearts finding a shared rhythm in the quiet dark. And when Sophie finally pulled back, just enough to look at him, she saw it, the thing she had been searching for since the first night, the thing beneath the ice and the empire and the cruelty and the control. She saw a man who had been 9 years old and alone, holding cold fingers, swearing he would never be helpless again. And she saw that he was, finally, after 19 years, allowing himself to be held. If this midnight found you, if the story wrapped around your heart and squeezed until you felt it in your ribs, then I need you to do one thing before you go. Smash that subscribe button on AMBW Romance Stories. Like this video so the algorithm knows this fire matters. Leave a comment. Tell me which moment broke you open. Tell me if you would have stayed or walked. Tell me what midnight means to you. And share this story with the woman in your life who needs to remember that she is not a debt to be repaid. That she is a grove, a root system, a sacred thing that no empire can own. Send it to her tonight. Tell her she is seen. Tell her she is chosen. Tell her the midnight belongs to her. The baobab trees in Kumasi stood tall through the dry season and the wet, their roots drinking deep from soil that remembered every name, every prayer, every lullaby sung in Chui beneath their branches. The grove endured. The Ajay name endured. And in a hilltop estate in Seoul, 2 people built something neither had believed possible. A life rooted not in obligation or ownership, but in the radical, terrifying act of choosing each other, night after night, midnight after midnight, teacup after teacup, until the choosing became as natural and necessary as breathing. Jun Seohan still bore his tattoos, the dragons and the geometry and the baobab roots on his neck, but Sophie added to them over the years, small symbols she designed herself, a clay pendant here, a Chui proverb there, inked into his skin by her hand in the quiet hours when the city slept and the study filled with moonlight. And Sophie still wore the clay pendant, warm against her throat, carrying the mineral memory of 9 generations into every room she entered, a reminder that she was rooted, that she was loved, that the sacred soil of her ancestors lived in her blood and in the man who had once tried to erase it and instead learned, at midnight, to kneel before it. The debt was never real. The grove was never truly lost. And the midnight, that liminal hour between one day and the next, between who you were and who you are becoming, belonged to them both forever and without condition. A space where 2 broken people had built a cathedral out of tea leaves and moonlight and the courage to say, "I am here, I see you, I am not leaving." The end. Thank you for spending time with us here at AMBW Romance Stories. If your heart is still racing, if you felt the heat of his breath on her collarbone, if you tasted the cedar and black tea on the air, then you belong here. New stories drop every single day without fail. Tomorrow, A new woman walks into a new cage, and a new man with ink on his skin learns what it means to be gentle with what he wants. You will not want to miss it. Subscribe now. Tap the bell. Make this channel your ritual, your sacred hour, the place you come when the world is too loud and you need to feel something raw and true and achingly tender. We will be here tomorrow, and the day after, and every day after that, as long as there are stories to tell and hearts brave enough to listen. Until tomorrow's story, you beautiful, stubborn, sacred souls. Sleep well, dream, and remember you are not a debt. You are a grove. You are a root system. You are the sacred soil, and no empire on this earth can own what grows in your blood.